Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to our discussion of the Cold War. All right, so getting back in, late 1960s, early part of the 1970s, we have what's known as the Vietnam conflict or the Vietnam War. You will hear both used, and here's why. Technically, Vietnam was never officially declared a war. In order for something to be, declared a war, Congress has to, officially declare war on someplace. That congressional decree never actually happened. So technically, yes, Vietnam conflict is going to be appropriate. It is going to be proper. However, those people who fought in Vietnam, those people who were on the ground, my father and father-in-law, for example. You ask those people that were there, you know what? It looked like a war. It sounded like a war. People lost their lives like a war. The people that were there are going to tell you it was the Vietnam War. I am not going to be one who is going to sit and um, try and contradict somebody who has that kind of life experience with it. If they say that they believe it to be a war, I'm going to go right along with them and say, hey, yeah, absolutely. If you say that it's a war, I'm going to go with war. So it really, you will hear both, and that's the explanation of why you'll hear both. We being the United States, begin becoming interested in Vietnam under President Kennedy, and it's ultimately going to be fought under President Johnson. They're going to first start to kind of pay attention to what's going on in conflict. It originally is going to be simply the Vietnamese fighting against their European colonizer, the French. They want independence, so they're fighting against the French. Well, once the French decide, okay, we're out of here, we don't want anything to do with this, at that point, then it becomes a contest of, okay, are they going to be democratic or are they going to be communist? There were people in the north that wanted to be communist, people in the south that wanted to be democratic. At that point, it falls right in line with that domino theory and that the idea of containment. This was another opportunity in the world to contain communism, to prevent the spread of communism. So that meant that we wanted to get involved. The Soviets, the Chinese, they were supplying and helping with the North. The South needed somebody to come in and help them as well. So we are actually going to get physically involved with troops on the ground, helping the South. Regular U.S. combat units are going to first be deployed in 1965. So that's really when it's going to first start out. A lot of people see this simply as just an extension of what had happened earlier with the Korean War. Same kind of concept, North versus South, communism versus democracy. So a lot of people see it's probably going to go the same way as it did. If you talk to the people who were fighting it, they say one of the most difficult things about the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War, was that it was really, really difficult to tell friend versus foe. You walk into a village, for the most part, the northern troops were not wearing uniform. You couldn't necessarily tell who was for you and who was against you. It made for an extremely stressful situation. Because on top of the, hey, you know what, I'm fighting in a war, now I have to be concerned about, even when I'm in friendly territory, the people out there may not be friendly. Um, because it was never actually declared a war, it never really got the full support of the military and the government. Never got the money, the troops, the strategy, etc. If it had been deemed a war, if it had been declared a war, there would have been a lot more put into fighting it as a war. But instead, because it's just what they call a police action, it's never going to get the full support. And a lot of people will point to that kind of being the reason why ultimately we're going to be on the losing end of it because we never really commit to it the way that we probably could have or should have. All right. I wish we had more time to talk about, Vietnam and what was going on, but we're really just short on time. So I'm just really going to give you a couple of things about it. The first big event in the Vietnam War that you're going to want to know about would be the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You had American ships off the coast of Vietnam, just kind of surveying the situation, just keeping an eye on things. And ultimately, there are going to be people on the coast that are going to fire at those ships. That kind of opens the door. It allows the president more authority to increase military presence. Why? Because our ships had been fired upon. That kind of allows the president to do what he wants to do in order to keep American troops safe. The other big one that we'll talk just a minute about is going to be the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive began in January 1968, and it was essentially the North launching a surprise attack on civilian and military targets in the South. They were trying to overthrow that government in the South. The big thing about it, not is that it was a major win for the North, because it wasn't, but what it did show was that, hey, you know what? The North can infiltrate the South. The North has operatives in the South. The North can get into the South and out of the South whenever it chooses to. So no matter how much we tried to secure it, it just wasn't going to be that way. So it basically shows that, hey, you know what? The South is incapable of defending themselves. We get to a point where it's clear that there's going to be no definite end. We're not without the resources being spent. This is just going to go on and on and on and on and on. So Americans begin pulling out once it becomes clear there's really no end. There's no clear cut. Here's what victory looks like, and direct involvement in our direct involvement is going to end August 15th of 1973. We're officially going to be fighting somewhere in the range of about 8 years. At that point, they go into what they call the Vietnamization of the war. We're going to pull out and we're going to hand it over to the Vietnamese themselves. But as we learned at the Tet Offensive, they're not going to last very long. And ultimately, um, Vietnam is going to become a communist country. Many at home really were not very much in support of this war. A lot of people, saw it as a civil war that ultimately we had no business in. We had fought in a lot of different places where containment was the reason for it. Well, people in the 1960s, 1970s were all about, we're going to kind of make our voices heard. You saw a lot of demonstrations, a lot of protests, and this was going to be no different. You saw a lot of people that had just become tired of the whole idea of containment. A lot of people that were not in support of putting American troops' lives in jeopardy in other places. There were a lot of people that saw this as, hey, you know what? The only people this benefits is the wealthy people. And they protest against that. You see, in some cases, it was, on college campuses, hippies, people that were considered to be draft dodgers, people that were refusing to go into the military. But at the same time, you also saw some people that had returned from Vietnam that were very much against it as well. So it's not fair to say, oh well, gosh, it was just the hippies that were protesting. Now that's not entirely true. Wish we had more time to talk about Vietnam, but we do have to move on. Okay, so the next thing on our list here is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the rest of these we're going to go through much quicker than we did Vietnam there. All right, so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is going to be an international treaty where the objective was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Yeah, hey, let's develop nuclear energy, but we want to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. We want to work towards disarmament. This is going to be an agreement that was signed in 1968, and it was extended indefinitely back in 1995. Essentially, 190 countries around the world have recognized that, okay, there are 5 states that currently have nuclear capabilities, and we want to try to that officially have that, and we want to try to keep it at that. Much smaller countries don't see the need to develop nuclear arms. Now, since then, four other countries are believed to have gotten nuclear capabilities, but are not a part of this non-proliferation treaty because ultimately it would be a violation of it. The other ones are India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Now, it should be mentioned North Korea was actually a member up until 2003. 2003, they decided they wanted to drop out of that, and then lo and behold, they developed nuclear capabilities as well. So, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed during the Cold War to try and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. SALT is going to stand for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. Okay, there are going to be two rounds of this. SALT one was in 1969, and that was headed up by President Nixon. Once again in 1979, this time headed up by President Carter. And these were specifically between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was all about arms control, not just nuclear arms, but ultimately, hey, you know what? There's a whole bunch of missiles out there that we just don't need all of this stuff. Let's see what we can do about reducing what we're going to have there. SALT 1 led to what's called the Anti Ballistic Missiles Treaty. SALT 2, there was an agreement, but it was never actually ratified because not long after that, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan, and that ultimately is going to put the brakes on all of this. So, SALT, all about not necessarily nuclear weapons, but smaller weapons. Hey, US, USSR, let's see if we can't reduce what we have. We just mentioned the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan. They do so first in December of 1979. They're going to be there until February of 1989. Short version of the story. Afghanistan was a very vulnerable country. It was a country that was basically being run by a bunch of different tribes, very much divided country. And there were some that decided, hey, we want to become communist. So the Soviets see this as an opportunity to decide, hey, we'll help out the pro communist people. There were groups that were going to be anti communist, specifically the group on the right here known as the Mujahideen. Um, the short version of this is because the Mujahideen are going to be battling against the communist government. The Soviets see that as an excuse to step in and try and help the Soviet government. Because of that, that's also going to be an excuse for the United States to get involved on behalf of the Mujahideen. Now, this is complicated. It's what we call a proxy war, where it's sort of US versus Soviet Union, but we've got other countries that are actually doing the fighting, kind of like Vietnam, kind of like Korea. So essentially, what's going to happen is this: the Mujahideen are trying to fight the Soviets. The Soviets have tanks. The Mujahideen have like rocks and small weapons. So we decide we want to get involved, but we know that man, there's a lot of people that don't like us getting involved in stuff like this. So what do? We go to the Pakistanis. We say, hey, we'll provide you with money. You buy Soviet-made weapons and give them to the Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen are going to wind up fighting against the Soviets with Soviet weapons paid for by the United States. And we use the Pakistanis to kind of cover up what it was essentially that we were doing. And so now that they have more modern weapons, they can more effectively fight. And the Soviets get to a point where, hey, we just can't do this anymore. Soviets' vision of Afghanistan is basically going to be their version of Vietnam. Same exact thing. It's going to go the way it did for us in Vietnam. Next, Mikhail Gorbachev is going to become the Soviet premier. That's their version of a president. He's going to become president in Soviet premier In 1985, when they put him in office, they believe that he's going to be a hardliner. He's going to be somebody that's going to come in and do whatever the Communist Party tells him to do. When he gets into office, he sees that the problems they're facing are much, much deeper than what he even imagined, and he winds up becoming not a hardliner but a reformer. He's going to become a person who decides we have to make major changes. He made two big changes to try and help things out. First one is called perestroika. This was simply a restructuring of Soviet businesses, how they operated. Rather than being owned and operated by the government, we're going to create some private businesses. The second was going to be glasnost. Glasnost was essentially going to mean a new openness. It's allowed media reports to come out without any kind of government censorship, allowing for freedom of the press, basically. He believes these two things can come in and help. Ultimately, they're really not going to make that much enough of a difference. Because not long after this, the Eastern Bloc nations are going to start to abandon communism. Between 89 and 92, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, places like that, they're all going to start to abandon communism. They see that it's just not working for them. The whole idea behind communism is that, hey, the government is going to provide for the people. Well, what's happening is they're no longer able to afford to be able to do that. Lots of things are not being made available. Basic things, food, employment, housing, and ultimately people are going to become upset about it. And communism works as long as they are fulfilling that promise. The minute they don't, that's a reason for people to go against it. It's commonly referred to as the autumn of nations because now things are falling back the other direction. Really, kind of shockingly, all of these countries are going to do this fairly peacefully. Romania is the only one that actually has some violence attached to it. All of these countries are going to bring in some form of democracy, which is going to rub more salt in the wound. And lastly, Germany for today. Germany is going to reunite October 3rd of 1990. Begins in May of '89 when Hungary starts tearing down its border fence and a whole bunch of East Germans flee. That's the first kind of indication that, hey, wait a minute, maybe people aren't happy in Eastern Germany. November 9th, 1989 is going to be the fall of the Berlin Wall. Um, this is going to be the official, hey, we're going to reunite Germany. It's going to be democratic. Um, to finish this up, Ronald Reagan was our president in the mainly in the 1980s. You think president in the 80s, and Ronald Reagan is your guy. He actually gave a speech in June 12th of '87. That was what was called the Brandenburg Gate, which kind of starts the call for the Berlin Wall to fall. One of the more famous things out there. So I figured we could take a couple minutes and watch this very short little video that provides you a little bit more information about